Hi, decolonization matters to me because as a white settler from European descent, I find that I have a big responsibility to kind of change the colonization process that's been going on for years and years and years in Canada. For me, how the question this week made me reflect on one of my the seminar course that I have for my practicum, and we had to read various codes of ethics this week, and I read the one from New Zealand, where they have developed a bicultural code of ethics, which kind of has a dual approach, and this way honors Maori people in a way. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and you know we talk a lot about anti-oppressive behavior, and or not behavior but approach, and in Canada and in social work especially, but it seems that our own codes here that guides our practice, are not inclusive, or are not like considering the whole colonization process. It doesn't recognize the indigenous worldview, and doesn't have a separate approach, or doesn't have a collaborative approach in the codes itself. So I think I'm referring to the CSW Code of Ethics and the Quebec Code of Ethics. What was interesting is in the New Zealand Code of Ethics, there's two quotes that I would like to read. So one is says that social work has grown out of humanitarian, philosophical, and religious attempts to find solutions to poverty and injustice. It originated in Europe and North America, and was brought to and further developed in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where it has played a significant role in the colonization process. And in their code, it says that it recognizes that it is neither just nor equitable to attempt to impose a set of values on all groups that live in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I haven't seen that in our codes, so I think as social workers working, or as future social workers, this is something that we could work on, the codes that guide us, and include more worldviews in it. Thanks.
Hello everyone, Erin here. So this week talking about racism, I think is very important, especially when looking at a decolonizing approach. And the readings really spoke to that this week, especially talking about not just racism at an individual level, but also a structural and systemic level. And I really, for myself, looking at this week as somebody who is white and a settler, looking at how my social location offers certain privileges and how it impacts what I may not see, and how I have blind spots, which Bishop talked about in their article. And furthermore, it looked at just challenging racist attitudes and belief, and constantly educating and informing ourselves. I know for myself, as an upcoming social worker, I think a huge part is just making safe spaces and for individuals to discuss their experiences with racism, and to be heard and acknowledged, I think is very, very important. I know one interesting learning from this week too was the Memi article, and asking who benefits from the argument of justifying racism and who is privileged in this discourse. Sorry. And this really made me consider why and how certain structural and institutionalized racism still exists, because for myself, this really made me consider more of the working with the decolonizing approach, and how we need to work beyond just an individual level, but at a larger structural level as well, and challenges the structural racism and the institutionalized racism as well that impact many people, and affects how they're able to access services, how they're treated when accessing these services as well. Whether it be something like education, or recently I had a conversation involving just how Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth were treated differently within the corrections system, and how it was not questioned and not challenged, but it was very evident within this conversation that racism was very alive and present, and how we need to challenge that and challenge these beliefs of just common sense, and change what the experience that individuals are having within certain structures and services they are accessing.
A decolonization approach matters in my workplace because I've come to discover that I am greatly triggered and disarmed by working with clients who exhibit racism. I need boundaries to self-monitor myself when widespread social difference presents as a struggle to articulate locations for the generations of policies whose aim has been to fragment and assimilate. I recognize the convergence and disparity between the values of the dominant society and those of historically oppressed, underrepresented, and so-called undeserving populations. I have to be able to bear witness to someone else's world without being defensive. I want to be able to stand up. A client recently said something to me that made me feel very ill. I couldn't shake it off, and I absorbed all the hate he threw my way, even though it wasn't about me, and I wanted to let it pass through me, and I didn't know how. Canadians every day take part in a polite racism that isn't created in a vacuum, but is reinforced and supported by our socioeconomic history and our whitewashed ideologies. Systemic and structural racism exists. I don't expect to change this person's views or even to conversate about where they came from, but I can expect myself to try next time to not perpetuate the space to speak in such dehumanizing ways. This can change multi-generational racist thinking towards Indigenous people.
A decolonizing approach matters to me in my work and at home because I feel that it can be difficult for people to understand the role they play in colonialism and racism and how this attributes to social injustice. And it was difficult for me to understand the role that I play in this field, in this area, because of the benefits I've been awarded because of the color of my skin or the country I was born into, and that those benefits were awarded to me on the oppression of others. So it's important for me in my work to constantly question ideas that come up around racism and colonialism, and coming at that from a decolonizing approach helps in that effort. I also feel it's important for me as a mother to a young son to set an example of who he is as well, instill an example of like who he is and a sense of pride in that, but also to understand that there is social inequalities and injustice in the world, and he needs to be aware of that as he moves forward into adulthood, and hopefully we can learn from some of our mistakes by educating our children. And one side note I just want to point out was I was reading this morning an article about a contamination to water in Flint, Michigan. It's an area I grew up near, and the people have been being poisoned with lead. It's now international news, and the city, the mayor and the city is being held accountable for it. But the Nisganika Nation in Ontario has been under a boil advisory for 20 years. Little to no attention's been paid to this. So it just goes to show you, you know, who gets a platform and why. I think it is very important to pay attention to this, and a decolonizing approach can help in this effort.
A decolonization approach matters in my life because it makes a direct impact on my family. Within the readings this week, I have to say that I have really related to the topic of white privileges. It is not until higher education that I started to learn about white privileges and decolonizations on a higher level. I personally have never put a second thought in how my white skin, brown hair, and blue eyes play a role in my day-to-day life as a privilege. It saddens me to think that I have been a part of the majority and taken full advantage of these white privileges, when I actually belong to a minority. However, my education has resulted in an awareness that motivates me to advocate against issues such as racism, white privileges, and oppression now. Due to my appearance, most all people I meet always assume I have a Scottish or Irish background. But little do people know, I am Native too. I usually get the deep-eyed glazed overlook with the reply, "You're Native?" with a confusion to follow. I do not hide who I am, but people make assumptions due to decolonization. I grew up not knowing that I was Native until 5 years ago. Therefore, have lived a very European lifestyle, but have been reaching out to my Native background within my community to learn about my heritage ever since. Due to the stigma my grandmother experienced because of decolonization, many heritage traditions were not passed down to the future generations within my family. This has made it difficult to learn about my family's heritage and bring back the pride in our culture. Luckily, society's attitude is changing in my community, and there is more acceptance now than ever before. I have been able to learn more and more about my Native heritage and decolonization and regain some of the culture that my family has lost. But mostly from my experience of being judged based on my appearance has resulted in learning opportunity. Within my practice, I take this learning curve to never judge or make assumptions because I believe every person has their own story to tell. And listening is how I will learn who they are. Due to decolonization, it is now very important to me to keep growing, to learn about my Native background, and to learn about these troubles that are in place because of society, so that we can overcome them and move towards an accepting society.
Decolonization matters to me, not just as a future social worker, but as a person, for many reasons. Obviously, we all went into social work, hopefully to better society and make some positive impacts individually and systemically. And I think looking at decolonization in terms of racism has really further illustrated that for me and how that plays out in practice. In our readings this week, I really reflected on the process of racism and how difference is created by the colonizer. And I relate that to Indigenous issues, as well as the article talked about anti-Semitism, and also right now the Syrian refugee crisis. I related all three of those issues to the process of creating difference. Decolonization is something that fascinates me. I read a book called Wretched of the Earth that looked at the Algerian crisis with France years ago, and that's also a framework that I really like to look at decolonization in. In terms of our practice issues, it's really challenging to think about how we as just one social worker or something like that can help the lives of people who do not, who aren't privileged, so to say, of white ancestry, and how white people have created difference for other cultures and races. That's something that I benefit from, unfortunately. I am a white European male, and I have to be very conscious of that when I am in service delivery and in practice. reflecting on our readings, one thing also really stood out to me, and this was from our talk back at the UVic, when Robina Thomas was talking to everybody about anti-oppressive living versus anti-oppressive practice. And these last 3 weeks looking at decolonization, and this last week looking at racism, I've really I really remembered that discussion on anti-oppressive living, and how as social workers, if we want to make systemic and widespread change, we need to not just think about practicing anti-oppressively, but really living our lives every day anti-oppressively. That's in the small decisions that we make during the 9 to 5 hours of work, as well as after that. I think that that's something that our society needs to do, and not just social workers, to live anti-oppressively and have a more collective culture. I think that that's being sought after by my generation. There's a lot of talk these days about the 1%, racism, multiculturalism, what is multiculturalism, and being in this course, and especially this week, has really brought out the racial aspects of those things to my mind. So that is why decolonization matters to me.